From Washington, NPACT presents a special report. The President on Watergate. Here is NPACT senior correspondent, Robert McNeil.
Good evening. In a few moments, President Nixon will speak to the nation for the first time on the Watergate and associated scandals which have come close to crippling his administration. Earlier today, Mr. Nixon announced the resignation of 4 key members of that administration. And now, speaking from the Oval Office in the White House, the President.
Good evening. I want to talk to you tonight from my heart on a subject of deep concern to every American. In recent months, members of my administration and officials of the Committee for the Re-election of the President, including some of my closest friends and most trusted aides, have been charged with involvement in what has come to be known as the Watergate affair. These include charges of illegal activity during and preceding the 1972 presidential election, and charges that responsible officials participated in efforts to cover up that illegal activity. The inevitable result of these charges has been to raise serious questions about the integrity of the White House itself. Tonight, I wish to address those questions. Last June 17, while I was in Florida trying to get a few days' rest after my visit to Moscow, I first learned from news reports of the Watergate break-in. I was appalled at this senseless, illegal action. And I was shocked to learn that employees of the Re-election Committee were apparently among those guilty. I immediately ordered an investigation by appropriate government authorities. On September 15, as you'll recall, indictments were brought against 7 defendants in the case. As the investigations went forward, I repeatedly asked those conducting the investigation whether there was any reason to believe that members of my administration were in any way involved. I received repeated assurances that there were not. Because of these continuing reassurances, because I believed the reports I was getting, because I had faith in the persons from whom I was getting them, I discounted the stories in the press that appeared to implicate members of my administration or other officials of the campaign committee. Until March of this year, I remained convinced that the denials were true and that the charges of involvement by members of the White House staff were false. The comments I made during this period, the comments made by my press secretary in my behalf, were based on the information provided to us at the time we made those comments. However, new information then came to me which persuaded me that there was a real possibility that some of these charges were true, and suggesting further that there had been an effort to conceal the facts both from the public, from you, and from me. As a result, on March 21st, I personally assumed the responsibility for coordinating intensive new inquiries into the matter. And I personally ordered those conducting the investigations to get all the facts and to report them directly to me right here in this office. I again ordered that all persons in the government or at the Re-election Committee should cooperate fully with the FBI, the prosecutors, and the grand jury. I also ordered that anyone who refused to cooperate in telling the truth would be asked to resign from government service. And with ground rules adopted that would preserve the basic constitutional separation of powers between the Congress and the presidency, I directed that members of the White House staff should appear and testify voluntarily under oath before the Senate committee which was investigating Watergate. I was determined that we should get to the bottom of the matter and that the truth should be fully brought out no matter who was involved. At the same time, I was determined not to take precipitate action and to avoid, if at all possible, any action that would appear to reflect on innocent people. I wanted to be fair, but I knew that in the final analysis, the integrity of this office, public faith in the integrity of this office, would have to take priority over all personal considerations. Today, in one of the most difficult decisions of my presidency, I accepted the resignations of two of my closest associates in the White House, Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, two of the finest public servants it has been my privilege to know. I want to stress that in accepting these resignations, I mean to leave no implication, whatever, of personal wrongdoing on their part. And I leave no implication tonight of implication on the part of others who have been charged in this matter. But in matters as sensitive as guarding the integrity of our democratic process, it is essential not only that rigorous legal and ethical standards be observed, but also that the public, you, have total confidence that they are both being observed and enforced by those in authority, and particularly by the President of the United States. They agreed with me that this move was necessary in order to restore that confidence. Because Attorney General Kleindienst, though a distinguished public servant, my personal friend for 20 years, with no personal involvement whatever in this matter, has been a close personal and professional associate of some of those who are involved in this case, he and I both felt that it was also necessary to name a new Attorney General. The counsel to the President, John Dean, has also resigned. As the new Attorney General, I have today named Elliot Richardson, a man of unimpeachable integrity and rigorously high principle. I have directed him to do everything necessary to ensure that the Department of Justice has the confidence and the trust of every law-abiding person in this country. I have given him absolute authority to make all decisions bearing upon the prosecution of the Watergate case and related matters. I have instructed him that if he should consider it appropriate, he has the authority to name a special supervising prosecutor for matters arising out of the case. Whatever may appear to have been the case before, whatever improper activities may yet be discovered in connection with this whole sordid affair, I want the American people, I want you, to know beyond the shadow of a doubt that during my term as president, justice will be pursued fairly, fully, and impartially, no matter who is involved. This office is a sacred trust, and I am determined to be worthy of that trust. Looking back at the history of this case, two questions arise. How could it have happened? Who is to blame? Political commentators have correctly observed that during my 27 years in politics, I've always previously insisted on running my own campaigns for office. But 1972 presented a very different situation in both domestic and foreign policy. 1972 was a year of crucially important decisions, of intense negotiations, of vital new directions, particularly in working toward the goal which has been my overriding concern throughout my political career, the goal of bringing peace to America, peace to the world. And that is why I decided, as the 1972 campaign approached, that the presidency should come first and politics second. To the maximum extent possible, therefore, I sought to delegate campaign operations, to remove the day-to-day campaign decisions from the president's office and from the White House. I also, as you recall, severely limited the number of my own campaign appearances. Who then is to blame for what happened in this case? For specific criminal actions by specific individuals, those who committed those actions must, of course, bear the liability and pay the penalty. For the fact that alleged improper actions took place within the White House or within my campaign organization, the easiest course would be for me to blame those to whom I delegated the responsibility to run the campaign. But that would be a cowardly thing to do. I will not place the blame on subordinates, on people whose zeal exceeded their judgment, and who may have done wrong in a cause they deeply believe to be right. In any organization, the man at the top must bear the responsibility. That responsibility, therefore, belongs here, in this office. I accept it. And I pledge to you tonight from this office that I will do everything in my power to ensure that the guilty are brought to justice and that such abuses are purged from our political processes in the years to come, long after I have left this office. Some people, quite properly appalled at the abuses that occurred, will say that Watergate demonstrates the bankruptcy of the American political system. I believe precisely the opposite is true. Watergate represented a series of illegal acts and bad judgments by a number of individuals. It was the system that has brought the facts to light and that will bring those guilty to justice. A system that in this case has included a determined grand jury, honest prosecutors, a courageous judge, John Sirica, and a vigorous free press. It is essential now that we place our faith in that system, and especially in the judicial system. It is essential that we let the judicial process go forward, respecting those safeguards that are established to protect the innocent as well as to convict the guilty. It is essential that in reacting to the excesses of others, we not fall into excesses ourselves. It is also essential that we not be so distracted by events such as this that we neglect the vital work before us, before this nation, before America, at a time of critical importance to America and the world. Since March, when I first learned that the Watergate affair might in fact be far more serious than I had been led to believe, it has claimed far too much of my time and my attention. Whatever may now transpire in the case, whatever the actions of the grand jury, whatever the outcome of any eventual trials, I must now turn my full attention, and I shall do so once again, to the larger duties of this office. I owe it to this great office that I hold, and I owe it to you, to my country. I know that as Attorney General, Elliot Richardson will be both fair and he will be fearless in pursuing this case wherever it leads. I am confident that with him in charge, justice will be done. There is vital work to be done toward our goal of a lasting structure of peace in the world. Work that cannot wait. Work that I must do. Tomorrow, for example, Chancellor Brandt of West Germany will visit the White House for talks that are a vital element of the Year of Europe, as 1973 has been called. We are already preparing for the next Soviet-American summit meeting later this year. This is also a year in which we are seeking to negotiate a mutual and balanced reduction of armed forces in Europe, which will reduce our defense budget and allow us to have funds for other purposes at home so desperately needed. It is the year when the United States and Soviet negotiators will seek to work out the second and even more important round of our talks on limiting nuclear arms and of reducing the danger of a nuclear war that would destroy civilization as we know it. It is a year in which we confront the difficult tasks of maintaining peace in Southeast Asia and in the potentially explosive Middle East. There's also vital work to be done right here in America to ensure prosperity. And that means a good job for everyone who wants to work, to control inflation that I know worries every housewife, everyone who tries to balance a family budget in America, to set in motion new and better ways of ensuring progress toward a better life for all Americans. When I think of this office, of what it means, I think of all the things that I want to accomplish for this nation, of all the things I want to accomplish for you. On Christmas Eve, during my terrible personal ordeal of the renewed bombing of North Vietnam, which after 12 years of war finally helped to bring America peace with honor, I sat down just before midnight. I wrote out some of my goals for my second term as president. Let me read them to you. To make it possible for our children and for our children's children to live in a world of peace. To make this country be more than ever a land of opportunity, of equal opportunity, full opportunity for every American. To provide jobs for all who can work and generous help for those who cannot work. To establish a climate of decency and civility in which each person respects the feelings and the dignity and the God-given rights of his neighbor. To make this a land in which each person can dare to dream, can live his dreams, not in fear but in hope, proud of his community, proud of his country, proud of what America has meant to himself and to the world. These are great goals. I believe we must work for them. We can achieve them. But we cannot achieve these goals unless we dedicate ourselves to another goal. We must maintain the integrity of the White House. And that integrity must be real, not transparent. There can be no whitewash at the White House. We must reform our political process, ridding it not only of the violations of the law, but also of the ugly mob violence and other inexcusable campaign tactics that have been too often practiced and too readily accepted in the past, including those that may have been a response by one side to the excesses or expected excesses of the other side. Two wrongs do not make a right. I've been in public life for more than a quarter of a century. Like any other calling, politics has good people and bad people. And let me tell you, the great majority in politics, in the Congress, in the federal government, in the state government, are good people. I know that it can be very easy, under the intensive pressures of a campaign, for even well-intentioned people to fall into shady tactics, to rationalize this on the grounds that what is at stake is of such importance to the nation that the end justifies the means. And both of our great parties have been guilty of such tactics in the past. In recent years, however, the campaign excesses that have occurred on all sides have provided a sobering demonstration of how far this false doctrine can take us. The lesson is clear. America, in its political campaigns, must not again fall into the trap of letting the end, however great that end is, justify the means. I urge the leaders of both political parties, I urge citizens, all of you everywhere, to join in working toward a new set of standards, new rules and procedures to ensure that future elections will be as nearly free of such abuses as they possibly can be made. This is my goal. I ask you to join in making it America's goal. When I was inaugurated for a second term this past January 20th, I gave each member of my cabinet and each member of my senior White House staff a special 4-year calendar with each day marked to show the number of days remaining to the administration. In the inscription on each calendar, I wrote these words: the presidential term which begins today consists of 1,461 days. No more, no less. Each can be a day of strengthening and renewal for America. Each can add depth and dimension to the American experience. If we strive together, if we make the most of the challenge and the opportunity that these days offer us, they can stand out as great days for America and great moments in the history of the world. I looked at my own calendar this morning up at Camp David as I was working on this speech. It showed exactly 1,361 days remaining in my term. I want these to be the best days in America's history. Because I love America. I deeply believe that America is the hope of the world. And I know that in the quality and wisdom of the leadership America gives lies the only hope for millions of people all over the world, that they can live their lives in peace and freedom. We must be worthy of that hope in every sense of the word. Tonight, I ask for your prayers to help me in everything that I do throughout the days of my presidency to be worthy of their hopes and of yours. God bless America, and God bless each and every one of you.
President Nixon, speaking from the Oval Office of the White House, and for the first time since news of the Watergate break-in last summer and the associated scandals that have been emerging about it, for the first time addressing himself directly to you, the American people, about it. To begin a discussion of the President's remarks this evening, I'd like to bring in Henry Truitt of Newsweek magazine, who's a regular White House correspondent, and also Frank Vanderlinden of the Nashville Banner, who covers the White House regularly. Clearly, Frank, the President was faced with a major problem tonight: how to restore his own credibility and, as he put it himself, the integrity of his office in the eyes of the American people who've been reading and hearing so much in recent weeks, things that might suggest that might have lessened their faith or confidence in the administration. How do you think he went about it, and how successful do you think he'll be?
Well, he did the first thing which he had to do, was to explain that he knew nothing about this bugging in advance. As you know, he said he first learned about it in June from the newspapers, gave the newspapers a little credit, and that they had no advance knowledge, and it was a shock and surprise to him. But this is the first thing he had to establish, because unfortunately there have been many rumors implying that since he is an expert in political affairs, he's bound to have known about it. And then he raised the second point, that this was the first campaign in which he was not in personal command of his own forces, that he had delegated this. And I imagine he regrets this too much to other people. This will not satisfy critics, of course. They still won't believe that if Haldeman and Ehrlichman, the men closest to him, had to resign, that somewhere along the line they wouldn't have told him something about it. However, it's conceivable that he did divorce himself totally from the day-by-day operations. When he went through this long list of major problems he's had to solve in the last year, and we know personally of his total concentration on foreign problems, it's conceivable that since he had directed that all political activities be taken out of the White House, he really did not know about this. We certainly have had no indication whatever that he did know anything about it in advance.
And yet I've heard, and I don't cover the White House personally, regularly myself, I've heard, as you must have, direct stories of the President at certain times during the campaign and pre-campaign period of involving himself very intimately in parts of the planning and advice to young aides in the campaign and that sort of thing.
Oh, I know personally that he took part in sessions planning strategy. For example, he met with John Mitchell perhaps 2 years ago. I think the overall strategy of the campaign certainly was set by the President, that is, which issues would be emphasized. He evidently decided earlier that his best campaign technique would to be a successful president, to bring peace in Southeast Asia if he could, to make the trips to China and Russia, and this would be his record, and he would run on that. But there is no evidence that after he had set up the committee to re-elect the president, that he then at any time had called in anyone and said, I wish you would find out what's going on in the Watergate. He did give us an interesting clue, just one clue as to why this was done. This has been the big mystery. Why would a supposedly smart group of politicians engage in this kind of activity? And the only clue I could see was when he made a reference to the ugly mob violence which has plagued the country, and said that it was understandable that people in their zeal would try to counteract this, and yet he said that the shady tactics were still deplorable and that the end did not justify the means. This is the first time he has said anything that might hint that one motive of the conspirators was to find out in advance whether there really would be a mob violence against the president, either at the Miami Beach Convention or during the campaign. They seem to have a real fear that we're sort of in a military situation in which it's our army against their army, and we have
suggestion has been put forward in the months.
This is psychologically true. It's the first time he's given us a hint.
The first time he has, yes. Hank Truitt, what did you think of the President's effectiveness in meeting this challenge this evening?
Well, I think in many respects, Robin, it was an eloquent speech, but the very eloquence and the points Mr. Vanderlinden has made tend also to give him the same credibility problem which exists in this thing, and that is that a man who has played the game very rough, admittedly on his part, through a quarter of a century, it's almost incredible that he didn't suspect that something was going on here more than he suggests in the speech tonight, that he didn't inquire. And as for keeping the White House out of politics, we all know that Bob Haldeman was in politics up to his ears in the course of this campaign. So we can accept the president's speech at face value and realize that he recognizes that his presidency is on the line. But I find that aspect of it, I have to keep he didn't erase my doubts in that respect. And as for the long term, I think he has a serious problem of credibility, and he's going to have to live with the continuing revelations of the court action and the committee hearings on the Hill, which are going to be very difficult for him. And he recognizes, I think, that when he comes out at the end of this process, that he's going to have to try to strike a balance. He'll have presumably new faces. We know new faces in the White House, and try to create an image for his administration which is beyond reproach at the time this matter is resolved in the courts, and hope that he can still maintain a credible and viable presidency through the end of his term.
Good. I'd like to broaden the discussion out a little bit. We have several more people with widely varying perspectives on these matters. Congressman William Cohen, a freshman Republican congressman from Maine. Mr. Benjamin Cohen, no relation to the congressman, who is a lawyer in Washington and was an advisor to the Roosevelt administration on securities regulation and then later on foreign policy. Mr. Cohen.
Also the Truman administration.
And the Truman administration. And Stephen Hess, who is an author, journalist, and was a speechwriter for President Eisenhower briefly, and then for Mr. Nixon, and is now a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Stephen, could I begin with you and ask you, what resources has Mr. Nixon got beyond his personal eloquence to pull himself and his administration up out of this trough of lack of confidence, confidence gulch, I think, as somebody called it today?
Well, I would say that in some ways the greatest resource is that of the people's will to believe in what he has told us. That is, that he did not have a personal knowledge of this, that the judicial process will go forward under Elliot Richardson, and that we will know the full story, and that those who are responsible will be prosecuted.
Well, what are the factors in the people's will to believe that?
Well, we have one president at a time. He happens to have had this happen very early in the term, so that in 100 days, as he pointed out in the speech today, so that we have almost 4 more years in which Richard Nixon will be our president. We wish that the integrity of the White House is maintained, and if we feel that the culprits are coming forth and are being prosecuted, then I tend to think that we'll want to accept his explanation that he himself was not personally involved.
Is the integrity, it's a difficult question, is the integrity of the White House synonymous with Mr. Nixon's integrity in this case?
Well, every president tries to make it so, and the public have a hard time separating the two. So what can one do? If one chose to impeach him, that would be the far end of a spectrum of possibilities that we have. That hasn't been seriously suggested as far as I know. So not going that far, we have the president, and as he campaigned quite cleverly and uniquely, re-elect the president, we will live for nearly 4 more years with this president. Also, of course, the president has tremendous resources, particularly in the field of foreign policy. Just think of this president and the number of times that we were virtually counting him out. And he came forward in August of '69 with his domestic program, and in August of '71 with his wage price freeze, and his announcement to go to China, and to the Soviet Union, and whatever events may be coming up this year in relation to Europe. So I think in a country that is basically not as politicized as we perhaps think it is in Washington, these future events, particularly events in foreign policy where the presidency has unique powers, may give him the powers to recoup his personal integrity and that of the White House.
Mr. Cohen, what are your observations on this, the ability of the president to recoup in a situation like this?
Well, I think one has to look at it from 2 points of view. He has asked Mr. Richardson to take charge of the investigation. I think Mr. Richardson has as high a reputation for integrity as one could ask. It does leave a question, though, whether it was wise on the president's part to choose a member of his own official family, and whether in the course of the investigation problems will not arise that may make the situation more difficult.
Are you one of those who believes that the president should appoint a special outside prosecutor in this case?
I think that would have been the wisest course to pursue. But he's taken the other course, and I think one has to bear in mind this investigation is going to take time and extend over quite a period. And I must say, I was a little disappointed that there was nothing in the speech indicating what steps he might take, not merely to ask the representatives of other parties and the people to join with him in working to restore the integrity and strengthen the integrity of the White House, but that he did not indicate that he had some plan that would strengthen the confidence and restore the confidence of the people in him. I can't help but go back to a period in the Roosevelt administration, quite different from this, but in a sense, no less serious. That was when President Roosevelt was trying to bridge the gap between his work on the domestic field in the first and part of the second term and his preparation for defense and war in the second term. He was confronted with the fact that the support he had before, which rested on a sort of coalition between liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans, the Follets and the McNairys, had broken down because a number of those who had been leaders in the so-called New Deal were strong isolationists and could not conscientiously cooperate with him. And so he had to turn, and he did turn, to the conservative Republicans, to Wadsworth and Austin and Lodge and others.
Are you suggesting Mr. Nixon should be turning to liberal Democrats to...
I'm only saying he has governed with a very small base. He has not succeeded, and he does not seem to put the same weight on the support of the Congress as Roosevelt and other of our presidents had.
Well,
and I am suggesting that in this period where government has been in a state of paralysis, it would be of great help if he did indicate that he was broadening the base. Roosevelt took into the government Stimson and Knox, and it gave great strength to the government and gave great support. And I'm not saying who he should bring in, but I think, in all fairness, he has had a tendency to divide the people in every of his endeavors. He's always concerned to exclude and some people from the area of cooperation because of his lack of trust of them. And it seems to me this is time. I don't suggest any person or any particular method, but it is time to try to get the country working together again.
I take your point, Mr. Cohen, and I'd like to bring in our representative from the Congress here, Congressman Cohen of Maine. Perhaps you'd like to comment on Mr. Cohen's suggestion, but I'd also just want to ask you, you've, like all the other congressmen, just returned from the Easter recess and close contact with your constituents. I just wonder, off the top of your head, how is the President's speech this evening, you think, going to be received by your constituents in Maine?
I think the constituents received it quite well. Part of the problem that I have perceived, at least in my own district, and I'm sure the same thing applies in many others, that until about 2 weeks, 10 days or 2 weeks ago, this was primarily considered to be a Washington matter, a sort of vendetta by the Washington press against the administration. In fact, I had spoken as early about a month ago in many strong statements of my own about the Watergate implications, and was surprised to learn that very few people were terribly concerned about it. I think their concern was heightened quite a bit in the last 10 days to 2 weeks, and as I just returned from the district, more and more people were asking me, particularly newsmen, were asking me about the Watergate affair and what its implications were, not only for myself, for Republican members of the Congress, but also what were the broader and more profound implications of the Watergate.
Do you agree with Mr. Cohen that the President could use as a technique for restoring confidence in his administration some broadening of the base, either by bringing people into the administration or a different attitude towards the Congress?
Well, I think the President has started to do exactly that. I don't agree that the President has been quite as rigid or narrow as has been suggested, because certainly in his prior administration, the first 4 years, we did have outside influences such as Patrick Moynihan, and certainly Mr. Kissinger wouldn't be considered to be within the same realm as those who are now being implicated in the Watergate. So I do think there is flexibility there. But what I would like to point out, I think the office of the Attorney General is so important, and he could not have picked a more capable, intellectually gifted, and morally upright person than Elliot Richardson to head this particular department, which has come under very severe criticism. And I think also there was another point in the President's message, and that was that Elliot Richardson certainly can select a special prosecutor himself, because I do think the office it's much broader than Watergate in itself. The office will deal with much broader problems, and so we do have to have, in our effort to regain this confidence, a man of that sort of ability and nationwide respect. But again, there is the suggestion that Elliot Richardson himself might select an independent person with perhaps no party affiliation or readily identifiable party affiliation to deal specifically with the Watergate. But I think the integrity that he will bring to the office will do a great deal to start a restoration of confidence.
Has the President's ability to govern been wounded, lessened by this series of revelations? And is merely this speech tonight and the changes he's made in the White House staff going to restore his ability to govern, if it has been lessened, considering that we have some months of hearings, trials, grand jury proceedings, and so on to go ahead? What do you think?
I think, Robin, he has been injured deeply in that respect. Now, I don't want to suggest that the administration's irretrievable, because such things are seldom absolute. But I wonder how much we're going to hear of the new federalism, for example. I must say that as a journalist, I had been looking forward to a classic struggle between the Congress and the executive on changes in the federal system of this country, which is what the President had set out to do in his second term. And I would suggest that the idea of a distinctively Nixonian second term, and which will end up with a appreciable change in the federal system, is almost by the boards. It seems to me that Congress is more important now than it was a week ago in that respect, and that, well, to put it another way, I would suggest that if the vetoes of the President's, which had been sustained by Congress a few weeks ago, were put to a vote in the next few weeks, that he might not be sustained in that regard. Now, this is the kind of thing I'm suggesting, and so I don't want to put forth the notion that he has been irrevocably wounded, but I would suggest that he is going to be much less powerful in his relationship with the Congress specifically. than he would have been otherwise.
I'd like to challenge that on the basis that the issue of inflation and the issue of whether or not we stop runaway federal spending without a tax increase is still there. And the president, as a matter of fact, before the Easter recess, had already beaten Congress on it. The fact is that both the Senate and the House, with the greatest possible efforts put forth by the Democratic leaders, had failed in either case to override the veto. Now, I think in the instant case, if we had a vote perhaps tomorrow, the president would not be able to rally quite as much strength. But when, as you say, we move on into the future and Watergate goes into perspective and is seen as by no means the most important event of the administration, then Congress must still come back to the issue that the president has raised, and he says it, and it's maybe oversimplified, but he says, do you want to raise your income taxes 15%? If you do, have Congress override my veto.
Well,
and then you see the people will be faced with the question, do they want their taxes raised? And everybody's going to say no.
Well, let's take this up with the congressman. This point
Yes.
of whether the Republican majorities on the Hill could be dragooned or would be as willing to be dragooned into support of White House policies and bills might be lessened by this. I mean, you're a Republican congressman, or would you be likely to vote less or more likely to vote for or against the administration because of all this?
Interesting question that you asked me, because while I still have a great deal of respect and admiration for the president, and always have, I was one of the few Republicans who voted to override the veto in the first instance. And,
so now you'll vote for it, will you?
So I'm not sure whether there's an irony in that at all, but I think the point is that I certainly place my vote on the basis of the value of the program that I voted to sustain, and not on a rallying behind the president as such. I felt that the issue was more important to my district than to follow a strict party line. And I intend to continue to do that. And I think most of the people that I know and come into contact with feel the same way. Now, with respect to the issues that are coming up in the future, I do think the president certainly has been hurt in that sense, and it was necessary to take this particular action to restore this faith. And I think you'll see a better relationship. Perhaps you won't have the constitutional confrontation and the budget crisis and so forth, as a result of those people in the White House who have just been removed from the White House not being there. In other words, I think part of the confrontation has come about as a result of the attitude on the part of the men who have built this wall around the president, insulated him from Congress, and have built up a fairly hostile attitude, generally speaking. I think with men like Elliot Richardson, Mr. Ruckelshaus, and those that I assume the president will be appointing will do much to ease that feeling and to establish a better rapport, and you won't see the confrontation.
That's a terribly important point.
And so perversely, the Watergate thing may have worked to ameliorate the president's relations with Congress and create a more smooth working administration. Do you go along with
yes,
that?
That's the point I was going to raise. That's certainly as well. That's certainly a possibility that it clears the air. Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman have been accused of being the heavies. I watched a network news program tonight where Senator Saxby was saying John Ehrlichman doesn't like people. Well, what an amazing, awful statement to make. But he's gone, and he does like people. He's a decent man. And we don't know who's going to be replacing him. But I did have the experience personally of being on the Eisenhower White House staff, arriving just at the time of the changeover from Sherman Adams to Jerry Persons. And it did make a considerable difference in the whole attitude, and the styles of the top staff men make a difference. Persons was a very affable Southerner, replacing a rather flinty New Englander, and there was a loosening up and a change in the relationship with Congress, and this conceivably could happen again.
I must say we seem to be drifting toward the notion somehow that Watergate is good for you, and I don't really believe that.
No.
I think the relationship between the Congress and the President might be ameliorated. We discussed the semantics of that for a moment. But what I'm suggesting is that in the process of amelioration, the President's original program will suffer, that the new federalism is in effect a dead issue, whereas it would certainly not have been a dead issue if he had been able to confront Congress on the terms in which he had established.
Let's take up
but
another...
Two points
but,
there, Hank. The first is, unlike Mr. Cohen's analogy with late second term FDR, where the president wanted Congress to do something positive and needed their positive votes, so far this president is acting as a check. He's saying to Congress, I don't want you to spend so much and so forth. Therefore, all he needs is enough to override the veto, and he's had a pretty
His
good...
problem will come when he tries to pass the special revenue sharing bill, which does require a majority, and he will have to build that majority, and this is where Richard Nixon will have to build this broader consensus, and I think he's smart enough to do it.
Now, that kind of
Well,
issue
you
is
don't
really
get any
the real
affirm-
issue.
Mr.
If
Cohen?
you don't get any affirmative program
No.
by veto.
No.
And the problem is there are differences of opinion as what these programs should be, the scope and whatnot. And it's not a question of confrontation that is important, but the thing that we have lacked for so long is the problem of cooperation. And I repeat, cooperation is a two-sided street, and it's not simply a problem of manners and whatnot. And the Monahans and the Kissingers are good as experts, but they do not have a political clout. They do not have the influence of comparable to, say, Stimson and Knox in the situation I referred to. And I think even beyond specific programs, a return to the conception that our Constitution looked forward not simply to a separation of powers, but to the cooperation of the Congress and the President is one of the most important problems of the day. And I only repeat my regret. Maybe this wasn't the time for the President to mention it, but when he is concerned with the future of his administration, I would hope that he would take occasion to show that he is moving away from confrontation to cooperation.
Could I raise another point? You mentioned consensus. One of the things that was being talked about, particularly at the Republican convention last year, was that now was the opportunity for the Republican Party to build itself a, if not permanent, at least long-lasting majority coalition along the lines that Roosevelt did and which lasted for a generation. Has Watergate damaged the Republican prospects sufficiently, do you think, Congressman Cohen, that it will make it unlikely that this coalition which was put together for this election will remain?
No, I don't think it's damaged it, certainly not irreparably. On the one hand, I think that temporarily at least, it has had its an immediate impact and will continue to do so as these revelations come forth. But I think in the long run, what we're talking about, the Republican Party stretching out or opening up to a wider consensus, not only of businessmen, but of working men. This, I don't think, will be altered. I think the basic appeal, the message that was being made, will still go out to the people that the President was seeking in terms of an open party door.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I'd like to say that the President has answered the first major question, which is that he knew nothing about this and had nothing whatever to do with it, and therefore it can't be blamed on Richard Nixon. And I think this also can be proved that it was not a Republican Party operation. If he has isolated this to such an extent that it can be seen by the public as just a little group of people who used to be in the committee for the re-election of the President, which, as we know, the regular Republicans envied and privately denounced as creep. If those people are out of the way, then the regular Republicans, as the Congressman knows, can then say, well, we have our party back.
That's a good point.
And the morale will go right straight up.
And it has to do, of course, with the kind of operation the White House had become. It was not a party
Right.
operation.
I think this is where George Bush comes into.
That's true. This is also goes to the point I was trying to make about the effort of the need of the President to compromise, because he now must become a party man. He must become a participant in a cooperative endeavor with Congress, whereas he certainly wasn't willing to do that before, because he felt he had the clout, if you will, in the White House to impose a specific kind of program. And what I'm suggesting is he doesn't have that anymore. He must give up some of that in the interest of the kind of cooperative venture.
But I think that George Bush, as chairman of the GOP at this particular point, the Republican National Committee, will provide that sort of positive influence of working together, much the one you're talking about, because a man who has political experience, and this is the one major criticism that Republicans have on the Hill, that the president being surrounded by men who don't have that sort of political experience.
Who are not politicians.
Right.
Yeah, but we can overstate the importance to the president at this time of his need for cooperation with the Congress, which would be true if the major thrust of the next 3.5 years, as the president sees it, was in terms of domestic policy. Now, we know historically that the longer any president is in office, the more he focuses his attention on foreign policy. This has even been shown by running every word a president said in State of the Union messages through a computer. And it's sure enough, each year more and more emphasis on foreign policy.
Wasn't this to be reversed in this administration?
Well,
that the first term was the foreign policy
I'm saying
term?
that these next 3.5 years, as I think would have happened even without Watergate, will be remembered, importantly, if they are remembered significantly at all, in terms of foreign policy. And in this particular area, the question of this sort of cooperation with Congress, a good in and of itself, is nevertheless not paramount.
I differ entirely. I think you're making a mistake if you think Congress and the people are going to accept anything that is done in the international field. We've gone through a period, and I think we're going to have quite a revision. I was brought up on the idea that we couldn't have secret treaties because of our Constitution. And we've not only departed from that, we've got conceptions now, not that the president may not state what his policy is, but a statement of the president binds successive administrations. And I think that doctrine is going to be called into question. And I think for the good of the country, I'm not opposing or supporting any particular doctrine, but I think in a democracy, the people have to understand the policies, and in some respect, during recent years, there's been a feeling that foreign affairs is a esoteric thing that the people can't understand, and even the Congress cannot understand.
I'm afraid our time is up, gentlemen, and I wish it could go on longer, and I want to thank you all for joining me. I just wanted to conclude on a little note that I think will bring some pleasure to the two journalists here, three if you consider yourself a journalist, Mr. Hess. Mr. Nixon met informally with reporters just after he spoke at the White House this evening, I've just been told, and he told them, "We've had a few differences in the past, but keep giving me hell in the future." So perhaps that means a new era in press relations. From Washington, this is Robert McNeil. Good night.
This has been an NPACT special report.